Caliban finally got his well-deserved rework, and it is glorious. If you want, you can simply stand by and watch your boys do all the work for you. So, in today's Warframe guide, I'm gonna tell you everything you need to know about Caliban, his skills, how to mod him, and of course, how you can get this juicy performance right here. A big shout out to Warframe's quest to conquer cancer, donate for the good cause via the link in the description, and with that being said, let's jump right into it. Alright, with Caliban, the first thing we need to talk about is actually not his skills, but a brand new status effect, and that would be Tau. Now, Tau damage was in the game beforehand, but it was only reserved for sentient enemies, and as far as I know, it also couldn't deal any status effects. But with the Caliban rework, now Tau got a status effect, and also we as a player now can deal Tau damage with Tau status effects ourselves. So, what does a Tau status effect do? Actually, it's pretty simple. Tau makes enemies more vulnerable to receiving status effects. Don't get it twisted, it does not mean that status effects deal more damage against the enemies. It's kind of like a passive status chance bonus for you, meaning the more Tau status effects are on the enemy, the more likely it is that you will deal a status effect when attacking those enemies. As you also see in the background right here, if they have Tau on them, we're gonna deal more slashes than if not. But now, let's take a look at Caliban's skills, starting out with his passive, which is very simple to explain because it's just adaptation, or adaptation light I should say, because in contrast to our adaptation, Caliban's passive maxes out at 50% damage resistance against any given status type. Just in case you're wondering, unfortunately it does not stack with adaptation, meaning if we put adaptation on Caliban, it's simply gonna start ignoring the passive as soon as it gets to over 50% damage resistance. Now, all in all, this passive is not all that great in terms of damage reduction, but as we're also going to see here in a minute, Caliban is very survivable already, and I personally don't think that we really need adaptation to make him survivable, therefore his passive nicely contributes a little bit to your survivability. Caliban's first skill goes by the name Razor Gyre, and this is actually pretty simple to explain. You quickly dash forward, spinning around your own axis, hitting enemies in an area around you. For every enemy that you hit, you regenerate a bit of your health. If your health is full, you regenerate shield instead. And if your shields are full, this also translates into overshields, which makes it a very nice survivability tool. But that's not it, because what it also does is, for every enemy that you hit with Razor Gyre, 25% of the energy that you spend for the ability cast will be refunded. What that means is it works very similar to Nidus's one, in that if you hit more than 4 enemies with this, then you will actually regenerate more energy than you spend for the ability cast, therefore you don't have to worry about your energy economy at all, and what's even better, if you use Blind Rage and therefore have negative efficiency, that's not a problem at all, because if you spend more energy on the cast, that also means you regenerate more energy with this skill. Now, one more thing I want to mention here with the shield regeneration is, Razor Gyre makes shield gating extremely convenient and easy even in the very high levels, because whenever your shield goes down to 0, you can simply cast it, fill your shield back up instantly because it bypasses the shield recharge delay, and therefore keeping your Caliban alive should absolutely be no problem. Oh yeah, and it can also inflict Tau status on the enemies that you hit, but that is really not what you use this one for. Ability number 2, Sentient Wrath. This one is, I think, one of the greatest crowd control abilities in the entire game now. What it does is, it creates an AoE around you, and enemies in this AoE will be lifted up, completely taken out of the action so that they can't do anything, and what's even better, they also get more vulnerable to your damage. So yeah, not much more to say. Not only can it lock down the entire room and disable all the enemies around you, it also amps up your personal damage, so what more can you ask for? Now, ability number 3 is by far the most complex, and I want to take a minute to explain it in more detail. It goes by the name Lethal Progeny, and this is the one where you can summon your own Sentients, bring your boys from the hood in to beat up all the enemies for you. With this ability, you can summon 3 different types of Sentients. You can switch through them by tapping the ability button, and then hold the ability button to bring in those that you just selected. As for which types of Sentients you can summon, you have one straightforward melee type, a ranged variant, and then a sort of support Sentient that isn't really offensive but helps you with your defense. Let's talk about what they can all do. The melee ones are pretty simple and straightforward. They are the heavy hitters, so to speak, going to town in melee combat, hitting the enemies either with a spinny attack that can inflict bleed status effect, or with just a normal punch that, however, deals more damage per instance than the spin attack. Oh yeah, and then also one time I also saw that one of them was lifting itself up and spinning around with those lasers that usually only the enemies do. I don't know if that's intentional or a bug, not sure if they're supposed to do this, but anyway, I just wanted to mention it. Now, if you ask me, those melee guys are the most consistent and also the strongest when it comes to dealing damage in day-to-day missions. They really have a strong punch. Next, the ranged Sentients also have two different types of attack. Either they can shoot normally or transform themselves into a mortar form where they shoot bigger AoE-focused projectiles. And their main deal is spreading tons and tons of Tau status. As you also see in the background right here, the status procs are going crazy with those. However, on the damage side, they are a hit or miss in my opinion. On the one hand, yes, if you test them in the simulacrum, they actually hit even harder than the melee types that I previously talked about, but when I tested it in practical gameplay, for some reason their AI just doesn't seem to be all that smart. Sometimes their targeting is completely off. I also see multiple occasions where they're either just aiming at a wall doing nothing or flying through the level not attacking at all. So when it's about damage, if they hit like an absolute truck, but in my opinion, they're very inconsistent in live gameplay. And finally, we have the support-focused Sentient. This one does not come as a 3-pack, but just alone. Therefore, it can open up a portal and spawn 6 more small Sentients. Now, just to get it out of the way real quick, the damage that these guys deal is pretty negligible. The main reason why you would want to spawn these in is that they distract the enemies quite a bit because they have a very high target priority. As you also see in the background, when they are on the field, you can pretty much just stand around and the enemies are going to focus on them and not on you. So much for which types of Sentients you can spawn. One other very important thing to mention here though is that whenever you have Sentients on the field and you are within their range, they will give you constant shield regeneration. How much per second is also shown in the top right corner of the screen. And the more Sentients are in your range, the more shield regeneration you get. Or in other words, if you spawn the support variant with its 6 little minions, then you will have a crazy shield regeneration value per second. One thing though, if your shields break, then the regeneration will also be stopped for the entire duration of your shield recharge delay. So unlike Arcanege's, this one unfortunately can't keep you in a constant shield gating scenario. And finally, ability number 4 is called Fusion Strike. What it does is you shoot out 3 energy rays in front of you, and enemies that are hit by them will get their armor and shield stripped away pretty quickly. And of course, it also deals damage and can inflict Tau status effect. At the end of the casting animation, there's also going to be a quick explosion at every enemy that got hit, kind of comparable to Corvex, but not as strong as he can do it. Quick side note, if you have the melee Sentients on the field and you cast the ability, then all of them are also going to cast the ability in the same direction. That is definitely nice and deals some decent damage. And this is the really big part about this ability that I think is a bit overlooked. After you've finished casting the ability, it creates an AoE around the point that you were shooting at, and for some time afterwards, the countdown you can also see it at the ability icon, every enemy that comes into this AoE will also have their defenses completely stripped away. So unlike for example Tharo Strike from Styanax, it's not just a one-tap armor strip, but also an AoE armor strip over time, and therefore in my opinion, the best defense reduction ability that we have in the game right now, period. Oh yeah, and before we go on, if you could maybe hit that like button, that would be amazing because it helps me out big time with the YouTube algorithm, so cheers so much for your support. Okay, now before we go into the build itself, let's quickly talk about how you might want to play your personal Caliban. First things first, whenever you feel that you A, need energy, or B, need to be healed or need shield regeneration, you quickly cast your one into a group of enemies and that should be taken care of, no problem. Then you want to make sure that you have your sentient allies on the field at any point in time. Which ones you choose depend on the situation. If you want to deal damage, you take the melee ones. If you want to spread Tau status effects, or you want to attack at range, then go for the ranged ones. And if you want to distract the enemies, be safe for yourself and have more shield regeneration, then you go for the support ones, which are by the way also very awesome if you play solo defense missions, because as it seems, they're not only distracting the enemies from the actual target you're trying to protect, but also it seems like that their shield regeneration extends to the defense target itself, making it very easy to keep that one alive. Just test them all out for yourself and see which is your personal favorite. Then, if you're dealing with armored enemies, make sure to use your 4 as much as you can so that you strip away all their armor. And if all of that is still not enough, you can always use your second skill to A, freeze all the enemies around you, and B, make them more vulnerable to your damage. But let's finally talk about the build, starting out with what I'm actually going for here. This build that I'm about to show you goes for absolute maximum range of 280 fat% to make sure that the AoE that you have after casting your armor stripping ability is as big as possible so that you can make it that the entire room is within the area, therefore every enemy coming in will instantly be armor stripped. It's super strong, you should definitely try it out, and besides that we're gonna go for as much strength and duration as we can. First of all, I want to talk about the helmet ability, and it should be said that Caliban actually doesn't really need a helmet. His kit is a perfect synergy, you don't need to infuse anything here if you don't want to. But there is a little funny trick that we can use with the helmet system, so let me take a second to explain that to you. What I did here is I used Grendel's Nourish and infused it onto the second ability. Now, you might think that is completely crazy because the 2 is such a great crowd control, and I fully agree, but you will understand it in just a minute here. Remember how Grendel's Nourish creates an AoE viral explosion whenever you take damage that inflicts viral to all the enemies around you? That's really good AoE viral application, right? And also, it not only increases your energy income, but it also adds viral damage to your weapons. Why is that important here? Well, I'm not sure if this is new or if this only came with the rework, but if you cast Nourish after you summoned your Sentient allies, then Nourish is going to be applied to them too. What that means is, whenever one of your Sentients is hit by an enemy, they will also have this AoE viral explosion priming nearby enemies. As you also see right here, this can get extremely chaotic as soon as you have a lot of these Sentients on field. And especially for the ranged ones, the viral damage is also going to be added to their cannons. So not only do they have the AoE, but they also actively inflict viral damage and therefore deal way more damage overall. This is, by the way, also why I got rid of the second skill, because if you lock the enemies down so that they can't attack, then they cannot hit my Sentients, therefore not triggering the viral explosion, and that means I miss out on a whole lot of viral priming this way. But of course, I'm not saying this is the be-all end-all solution and that everybody should do that. You of course do whatever you like with your personal Caliban. But alright, now that you know what we're going for, let's finally start with the build, going into the Archon shards first, and this one is again pretty straightforward. I personally went all Tau Forged here, but you don't have to do that, you could also go for the normal ones. And I used 2 blues for more maximum energy, freeing up the flow mod slot in the build, and then I fully doubled down into ability strength because it helps out with pretty much every skill in our setup. If you wanted to, you could also go for casting speed instead, especially for the 4th skill, but I personally didn't feel it was all too bad. Next, let's take a look at the mods here where, as I initially said, I went for the maximum possible range with Overextended, Augur Reach, Stretch, and Cunning Drift in the Excel slot, just to make sure that the AoE armor strip inflicted by our 4th ability is incredibly big. Then, much more ability strength with Umbral Intensify, Transient Fortitude, Mold Augmented, Growing Power in the Aura, and Blind Rage. Blind Rage in specific here not being a problem with the energy because, as I said in the ability section, our first ability regenerates more energy if we have less efficiency, therefore this is not going to hurt us at all. And then I also went for a bit of duration with Mold Efficiency and Primed Continuity. If you wanted to, you could replace Mold Efficiency with Arcane Ice Storm. That would give you even more ability strength and also a little bit more duration. But with Arcane Ice Storm, of course, you always have to make sure that you apply tons of cold, so depending on your weaponry, this might or might not fit your personal loadout. Finally, Primed Redirection to get more shields so that A, we can be a bit of a shield tank, but if we take too much damage, it's also not going to be a big problem because with our first skill and the shield gating and vulnerability time frame, we should have no problem whatsoever keeping Caliban alive. This right here would be the full build setup. It should be said though that in the Aura mod you can pretty much go for whatever you like. I just went for Growing Power, but you could totally go for anything else here, it's not super mandatory. And if you wanted to double down with the setup more into shield gating rather than shield tanking, then I would recommend swapping out the Exilus mod for Primed Sure-Footed, because every serious shield gating setup should have Primed Sure-Footed, as well as replacing Overextended with Rolling Guard, just to make sure that whatever happens, you're gonna be safe and sound. Now, in case you're new at Tenno and you don't have all those fancy mods yet, don't worry about it. First and foremost, you don't need the primed version of all those mods. You could always replace them with the normal ones without losing too much power. And also, this build right here would be a more budget-friendly approach without arcanes, without Exilus mod, and you're still gonna get some very nice performance out of your Caliban using this setup. Now let's finally also quickly talk about the companion and weapon options, where I went for my Nautilus plus Verglas setup that I already showcased in this video right here, just so I don't have 3 but actually up to 6 allies on the field dealing damage. Don't underestimate Nautilus and his clones, they're dealing quite a lot of damage. This right here, by the way, would be the Nautilus build, this here the Verglas one. As for weapons, you're pretty much free to use whatever you want, but given the fact that the Tau status effect increases the likelihood that enemies will take status effects from you, I would personally recommend going for status-heavy weapons, maybe also damage over time, just so that you can go really ham with all those status effects that you're going to be dealing on the Tau-primed enemies. Just one note though, if you want to make sure that your Verglas on the Nautilus deals as much damage as possible, you gotta have a rifle-type weapon equipped on Caliban with Galvanized Aptitude and Galvanized Chamber on it, because if you trigger the galvanized effects with your Caliban's weapon, then they're also going to be applied to the Verglas if it has exactly the same galvanized mods equipped. And one last thing I absolutely have to say about Nautilus is, the only reason why I even can use Nautilus in this setup is because I subsumed over Caliban's second skill. If you don't do that, and you actually intend to use the second ability, then please go for any other companion but not Nautilus, because when the enemies are lifted by your 2, and then Nautilus does his grouping skill, they somehow weirdly float away into the air, which is very inconvenient. I hope they patch that out soon, just so that you know. But which companions and weapons do you like with your Caliban? Let me know in the comments down below. And if you now also want to know everything about the brand new Warframe Kome, then don't miss my guide on her right here. Another massive shout out to Quest to Conquer Cancer, link in the description. We see each other, hopefully in the next one, and until then, as always, good loot.